Hello everyone, so welcome to this video. This is my presentation for Ocean Sciences in 2022. And today I'm going to tell you about this recent study we published in the Journal of Climate, Adiabatic and Diabatic signatures of ocean temperature variability. So this is work led by myself. I'm at the University of Sydney in Australia, and my co-authors are Taimur Sohail and Jan Zika from UNSW. So by way of introduction, the focus of this talk is on ocean heat content internal variability. So we know that the 3D evolution of ocean heat content or ocean temperatures is complicated. There's a whole pile of different processes that influence the heat content of it at a given location, and there's lots of different spatial and temporal scales involved. And so one key question we're interested in answering is, how do we separate force trends from internal variability? Now, one method that has been suggested to address this issue is by doing analyses in water mass coordinates, so Lagrangian coordinates where we're following water masses around. Now, this has been assumed in the past to filter out internal variability because a lot of this internal variability is associated with adiabatic processes. So an example of that is wind-driven Ekman pumping, which drives heaving of isopycnals up and down in the ocean. Now, one example I'm going to talk about in this talk is ENSO, so the El Nino Southern Oscillation. The top right panel here is data from Argo. It's the globally average temperature anomaly as a function of depth. And you can see an ENSO signature in here in terms of these dipoles of warming in the upper 100 meters during an El Nino event and cooling in the below that. So this is basically associated with flattening of the thermocline in the Pacific Ocean during an El Nino event. And I guess the question I want to ask here is, this is the depth coordinate analysis. If we were to do the analysis in temperature coordinates, would we actually see a reduced amount of variability? So is this point that I've made here actually true? Now, this has been looked at in the past. Particularly one study I want to highlight is this one by Matt Palmer in 2007 in GRL. So he compared temperature variability averaged over the top 220 meters in orange compared to average above the 14 degrees Celsius isotherm in blue. Now I'm just going to swap to the Pacific Ocean just to illustrate the point. You can see that the depth coordinate analysis is affected by more noise, more variability than the temperature coordinate analysis. It's reduced about 30 to 40% in the temperature coordinate. And so this suggests you might actually have an easier time identifying force trends if you use the temperature coordinate versus the depth coordinate. So what we're going to do in this study is basically look at this idea in a climate model. So we're going to use the AXIS CM2 CMIP6 pre-industrial control simulation. And we're going to do a really rigorous comparison between three different coordinates: a depth coordinate, a temperature-based water mass coordinate, and also latitude coordinates. And we're going to look, as opposed to Matt here, we're going to look across all possible temperature and depth and latitude isotherms, I guess, or depth surfaces. So going on to the methods. So as I said, we're going to compare globally integrated temperature variability between these three coordinates. Now, a key thing we have to take into account here is, particularly for the temperature coordinate, layers bounded by isotherms can vary in time. Their volume can vary in time. And to avoid that, which introduces, if the volume is varying, you actually have some arbitrary nature to the heat content variability because of the reference temperature dependence. So to avoid that, we're going to use this volume percentile framework, which was introduced by Taimur and Jan and I in this GRL article in 2021. So basically what we mean is, instead of considering isotherms, we consider the surface that bounds, say, the warmest 50% of the ocean. So the isotherm, or the temperature label associated with that surface, can change in time, but the volume bounded by that surface is constant. And for consistency, we're going to do the same thing in depth and latitude. And you can just see the kind of labels I put on the edge here. These are from the mean state of AXIS CM2. So basically 50% of the ocean volume is above 2003 meters in AXIS CM2. And 50% of the heat content of the volume is above the mean temperature of 3.2 degrees Celsius in AXIS CM2. Now, we're also going to look at heat budgets, which I've just shown kind of in a summary format at the bottom here. The key point I want to make is that the depth and the latitude percentile frameworks are affected both by diabatic processes, so that's surface fluxes, which is this forcing Z and forcing phi term, and mixing, so vertical mixing in the C case, and the latitude component of a long isobutanol mixing in the latitude case. But the temperature percentile budget is only influenced by these diabatic processes, so forcing and mixing. The depth and the latitude percentile framework also have this advection term, this adiabatic advection term associated with heaving. Okay, so move on to some results. What I'm going to show you is depth, temperature, and latitude percentiles, which I'll make appear in a second. Time series, so we're looking from year 50 to year 600 of de-drifted, de-seasoned temperature anomalies from Access CM2. Now, the first panel here is in depth percentiles. So the top here is the surface, and the bottom here is the deep ocean. The conversion between depth and depth percentiles pretty linear, actually. You can see that on the left here. And so the variability, you can see there's lots of stuff going on. We've got kind of a decadal to centennial frequency signal in the interior, which I'll look at in a little bit more detail in a second. If we zoom in on the surface, we see this dipole signature associated with ENSO. So the black line here is the NINO 3.4 index. So it's the same as what we saw in the Argo analysis. Now we can compare that to temperature percentiles. So in the second panel, 0 here is the warmest waters in the ocean, and 100 is the coldest waters of the ocean. The conversion here is a bit more nonlinear. You can see the scale dependent here on the mean state of Access CM2 on the left. And so you can see some similarities and differences between these two. We have kind of a similar, maybe low frequency signal in the interior. Zooming in at the surface, you can see some differences, although there is some hints of some dipoles here, which I'll show you more clearly in a second when we look at ENSO. And another kind of key difference is when you look at temperature coordinates, you separate out the coldest temperatures of the ocean. So these are actually surface waters in the polar and subpolar regions, which are kind of mixed in with everything else in the depth percentile, but nicely separated out when you look at temperature percentiles. And you can see kind of a low frequency signal in there, which I'll talk about briefly later on. And then finally, latitude percentiles. So there's variability everywhere in latitude, and near the equator, which is at about 50 to 60%, you can see kind of a higher frequency signal, which again is ENSO. Okay, so to clean this up a little bit, start off by looking at ENSO. What I'm going to do here is take the same data on these three panels and regress it onto the NINO 3.4 index, so onto this black line in this panel here. So what we get is something that looks much smoother. This is a lag regression. So 0 here is at the peak of the NINO 3.4 index, so peak of an El Nino, and then you go forward or backward in time from there. And so in the depth percentiles, you can see this kind of typical dipole where you have a warm up 100 meters and a cold below that, associated with that flattening of the ice of the thermocline in the Pacific. Now, the key point is when you look at temperature signals, you can see that ENSO still has a signature in this diabatic temperature coordinate. So ENSO has a diabatic signature, I guess is the key point there. Now, this signature is a little bit narrower in terms of its volume range. It's restricted to kind of everything above maybe 15 degrees Celsius, which is a smaller volume than affected by depth. But similarly, kind of the signal is kind of similar, which is kind of interesting. Now, a nice thing about these figures is we can also link this to warm water volume variability. And so we know that during an El Nino event, we get a discharge of heat content away from the equator. And so we can see that actually really clearly in the latitude percentile here, where we have warm anomalies, which transition to cold anomalies as that warm water is discharged away from the equator. But an important point to make here is there's also a discharge of warm water volume in temperature percentiles. And so this is, again, there's no latitude bounds here, but it's indicating that we're actually losing water volume from everything warmer than 20 degrees Celsius and actually discharging that. And so this was looked at in a little bit more detail by a PhD student of mine in a 2020 Journal of Climate article. Now, we also looked at budgets. I'm not going to show you those results because of time, but basically we saw that the depth and latitude changes in these two panels, the first and the third, were driven dominantly by advection, while the temperature changes were driven by surface fluxes dominantly, but also vertical mixing was playing a role here, and that's been looked at in a couple of recent papers. So going on to slower frequencies, we can see this kind of decadal to centennial signal in the interior here. To look at that in a little bit more detail, I'm going to take time series of temperature anomalies averaged between 10 and 30%, both in temperature and depth percentiles. And so that's what I'm showing here on the top right. The black is the depth and the red is the temperature line. Now, these two are closely correlated, which we might have expected from this panel, where you can see kind of a red, red, blue, blue. So there's a relationship there. Correlation's about 0.66, so it's moderate. Now, what is this signal? Well, to kind of look at that in a little bit more detail, the second panel here is regressing those time series, the depth one, in fact, onto zonal mean temperature anomalies. And so you can see the signals associated with this warming of the upper 2,000 meters and cooling below that, which you can see. And this kind of correlates with where the mean temperature surfaces are in terms of the red line at the top. Now, it turns out that this signal is strongly correlated or strongly related to variations in the global meridional overturning circulation. So that's what I'm showing in the bottom two panels here. These are lag regressions of the GMOC onto this time series. So the third panel here is at a lag of minus 40 years. And what it shows is that you have a weak enterhemispheric overturning cell 40 years before you get this signal. So this is a weak AMOC, effectively. And we know that the AMOC generally pumps heat downwards across 1,500, 2,000 meters. And so it makes sense. We have a weak AMOC here. It's weak downward vertical heat transport, which leads to a warm anomaly at the surface in the upper 2,000 meters and a cold anomaly below. And then that recovers 40 years later, and we go back the other direction. The final thing I want to point out on this slide is that we also see a signal in the bottom water cell here in the southern hemisphere. And actually, if you look closely, you can see that that signal is correlated with the decadal signal at cold temperatures that I saw, I guess, is it on the previous slide here? Yeah, so this signal at the coldest temperatures here is also related. Okay, we also did spectral analysis to look at this in a little bit more detail. This is comparing variability as a function of frequency between temperature in red, depth in black, and latitude in blue. And so at interannual frequencies, which is really dominated by ENSO, as I mentioned before, the variability is weaker in the temperature compared to the depth by about 50%. So that's that removal of the adiabatic signal ENSO when you go to temperature coordinates. Whereas at decadal to centennial frequencies, we see kind of comparable variability between temperature and depth. So this is really highlighting the role of diabatic processes at these lower frequencies. Okay, so finally, and so we also looked at the budgets here. So looking at the temperature budget here, I won't look at this in much detail, but I just wanted to point out that in the temperature coordinates, the tendency, which is the variability, which is the magenta line here, is really dominated by surface forcing. There is some compensation by mixing at lower frequencies. Whereas in depth and latitude, really the variability is dominated by this adiabatic advection, particularly at interannual frequencies. Mixing does play a bit of a role at lower frequencies in depth. So finally, just a point of discussion, what are the implications of these results for climate noise and separating force trends? So what I'm showing you here is a summary of, this is the standard deviation of variations in the total heat content integrated down to a certain level. So in depth in black and temperature in red. So the Palmer analysis that I highlighted in the introductory slide, that's basically picking out this 14 degrees Celsius or 220 meter depth surface here. And so I guess the main point here is that the total variability here is dominated by decadal to centennial signals. So that's the dashed red and dashed black line. And that consequently, there's only a small reduction in the variability when we go to the temperature coordinate because of how diabatic those low frequency signals are. Similarly, if we look at trends in linear trends in heat content, at 51-year trends, we see, again, a small reduction of about 10 to 15% in these trends or in this kind of climate noise. Whereas at kind of higher frequencies, again, we remove that ENSO signal. That's about it. Okay, so just to summarize, basically, we've done a rigorous comparison of heat content variability between these two Eulerian coordinates of depth and latitude and this water mass-based temperature coordinate. We found that at interannual timescales, the variability in temperature coordinate is about 50% of that in depth because of the removal of that ENSO adiabatic signal, but ENSO still has a significant signal in the temperature percentiles. At decadal frequencies, the variability is much more comparable, highlighting the results of the diabatic, the important role of diabatic processes, and we saw that the variability is associated with meridional overturning circulation. So I guess the main take-home points are that internal variability has a strong diabatic component, particularly at decadal timescales, And so this basically meant that we only saw a small reduction in climate noise going to the temperature coordinate from the depth coordinate. Now, this differs a little bit from the results of Palmer et al., and I suspect that the reason for that is because we have perfect model knowledge of everything that's going on in our model, whereas his analysis was observationally based, and so this kind of going to temperature coordinates might have more advantage in removing some of those sparse sampling biases that you get from that analysis. So that's it. Thank you for listening. Please let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them via email or in the discussion. Thank you.